In this Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Starlined Samurai build. This is a build using the Starlined Sword, which is a katana that you can get pretty early on in the DLC if you know where to pick it up. And this is kind of an interesting weapon in my opinion. It does both physical and magic damage, with about 2/3 of the damage being physical and 1/3 being magic. It scales with strength, dexterity, and intelligence, although the dexterity scaling is far better than either strength or intelligence. And it has quite high intelligence requirements for a weapon that doesn't scale very well with intelligence. Additionally, it has pretty short reach for a katana in my opinion. It is not one of the longer katanas in the game, so that can be kind of difficult. But it does have blood loss buildup like a lot of the other katanas do as well, so that is a bonus. So I did a lot of testing with this weapon, and I essentially came to the conclusion that you should basically treat this weapon like a straight sword. And that's because the length is about the same as a straight sword, and playing two-handed didn't seem to make a lot of sense because you don't have a lot of strength with this sword. You're not going to get a lot out of it, so two-handing for some extra damage from strength isn't great. And it just seems to work better in a build that's got like a shield in the offhand and using this in your main hand. And a lot of this is because when you start playing around with Onze's Line of Stars, which is the weapon skill of this weapon, you'll start to realize that it's very effective in some situations, and it's not so easy to use in other situations. What this weapon skill does is it does a chain of attacks, and you can press the subsequent follow-up button twice. So you can press it once and get swing, swing. You can press it again to get a swing, and then kind of a twirly swing, and then press it again to like vanish, and then do like a somersault attack. And this weapon skill is really good for when you're like facing elite enemies that you can stun lock with it. You can just hit them over and over and they can't do anything. And then if they're not dead, you just follow up with a repeat combo of this weapon skill and they'll go down. So that's really good in those situations. It's good for cleaving through multiple enemies. And you'll notice that the weapon skill has much longer reach than the weapon. So even one button press can help you hit an enemy that's further away than you could reach with this weapon normally. So you should kind of learn to judge when using this weapon when to just use one L2 press to get a little extra reach on your weapon attack, and when to, attack regularly. And one of the things I really like about this weapon skill is that you don't have to do the full chain, right? A lot of weapon skills, you have like a combo that happens and you can't interrupt the combo once it starts. So this one, like you can hit once, and if you like the swing swing and you don't have room for another, you don't do anything. Or maybe you can get 2 presses of L2 off, but not the third. Or maybe you can get the full combo off, and judging that based on what's happening takes a bit of practice in learning the moveset of enemies, so it can make it a difficult skill to use. Additionally, a lot of bosses are very hyper-aggressive, and they just don't give you a window to do the full combo of this weapon, even though you really, really want to. So, that's another reason why it's good to, sometimes just do like the first part of the combo or the second part, but not the full thing. And I'm using the Wolf Crest shield in my offhand for a medium shield for this build to give me decent guard boost. Maxed out, this thing has 66 guard boost, which is pretty good for a medium shield with 12 strength requirements. You could use the Carrion Knight shield, but you're going to have lower guard boost, so I don't recommend it. This really allows this build to come together. This shield, with such good guard boost, you can block a counter easily. Because you have some points in intelligence already to use this weapon, you can use something like Scholar's Shield to buff it even further, to give you even better guard boost for a limited time during fights, and that can make things a lot easier too, especially against bosses that hit repeatedly or hit very hard, and that's not going to take away a lot of stamina, allowing you to block counter. I also typically use no skill on this shield in order to use Onze's Line of Stars when I want. I can block counter, and then if I have an opportunity, I can use Onze's Line of Stars. Like if I have a good opening or something, it does happen, or maybe I have an opening but I'm not close enough. This can give me a little bit more distance so I can hit an enemy that I would normally not be able to hit with a regular melee attack. However, there is a case for a couple other skills you could put on this shield, and those are Carrion Retaliation and Barricade Shield. So Carrion Retaliation is basically, you can put it on there if you know you're going to be fighting enemies or bosses that fire a lot of projectiles, so you can grab those projectiles and then use them as weapons against the boss. And it also allows you to parry very effectively with a medium shield because it has more of a iframe window than the regular parry does on a medium shield. So it works out really well. So this allows you the option to do block counters or to parry when you are in a boss fight, and that can work out really well. And sometimes it's just nice to be able to grab projectiles. And the other one, Barricade Shield, works really well for some boss fights if you decide not to use Scholar's Shield, as it allows you to block more effectively, block counter, and then when an enemy is like guard broken, you can either critically strike them, or you can, use Onze's Line of Stars on them while they're rendered ineffective and get a lot of damage that way. So that's also a good one. So sometimes, depending on the boss that I'm facing, I'll switch back and forth between these skills. but I usually default to no skill. So for armor for this build, I'm using the Iron Casa, the Tree Surcoat, and then the gloves and legs of the White Reed set. And that kind of gives me this like samurai knight style that you see on the screen, but it doesn't have enough poise. It's got like 41 poise with this setup to get over that 51 poise breakpoint. So I have to use the Bullgoat's Talisman with this in order to be able to pull off this fashion and still hit that breakpoint. So if you were min-maxing, you would probably pick an armor set with at least 51 poise. That would free up a talisman slot for you, probably get you better protection as well. And you'd be able to play this build a bit easier, but you know me, I prioritize fashion over everything. So that's why I went with this. And I will just mention here really briefly as well that the Spellblade set does increase the damage of Onze's Line of Stars, but because this skill does 2/3 physical and 1/3 magic because of the scaling of the weapon, you're not going to get as much effectiveness out of it as if this weapon skill did all magic damage. You're only going to get like 1/3 of the effectiveness of that set, so I don't recommend using it. So talismans wise for this build, one of my slots is occupied by Bullgoat's Talisman because of my unoptimal armor setup for fashion, but I will go through some suggestions to replace that as well. So kind of my two staple talismans for this build are Shard of Alexander. This allows us to get more damage with Onze's Line of Stars whenever we use it, and you will use it regularly, so that's really good to have. Secondly, the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman is really good for this build because Onze's Line of Stars uses a lot of stamina. When you're block countering, you use a lot of stamina. You roll a lot, you're using stamina, so it's a good way to get your stamina back, allow you to use block counters, and then return stamina in order to be able to block again or to attack. So I basically always keep those two equipped in this build. So in the other slot, when I'm out on the landscape, you can kind of go two ways. You can either go Crusade Insignia to give you increased damage when you kill enemies for amount of time, and that's not a bad one to have overall. It's good for pretty much any build on the landscape if you're moving quickly. But if you're moving slowly, you might want to use something like Blade of Mercy in order to give yourself increased damage after you do a critical strike. So if you block, counter, and then critically strike an enemy, you'd gain attack power for a bit of time after using that as well. And you can use either of those, and you can even double stack those. So you could have Crusade Insignia, get rid of Bullgoat's Talisman, and then have Blade of Mercy if you had a more optimized armor setup. Those would be two really good ones to have out on the landscape. And a few other talismans that you might use that you might swap in depending on what boss you're facing or what enemies you're facing are the Curved Sword Talisman to increase your block counter damage when you do that return slash. That can be really good if you find yourself going with a block counter strategy in a boss fight. I don't find you need it out as much on the landscape because you typically stance break an enemy and then finish them with a critical whether you have this or not. Another option is the Great Shield Talisman to give you further guard boost on your shield if you find yourself blocking a lot in a boss fight. So that's one that you could use as well. And then either Millicent's Prosthesis or Rotten Wing Sword Insignia will increase your damage with rapid strikes. This really only happens, in my opinion, with this build if you find yourself using Onze's Line of Stars a lot during a particular boss fight. And I think those boss fights are few and far between, so I wouldn't recommend using that one all the time, but there might be a couple cases for it. So stat-wise for this build, I have 55 Vigor, 26 Mind, 30 Endurance, 12 Strength, 70 Dexterity, 21 Intelligence, 7 Faith, and 9 Arcane. You don't need any Faith or Arcane for this build. Those are not attributes we'll be using. Vigor is at 55 in this build. That's pretty standard for DLC builds. Most DLC builds are going to have somewhere between 55 to 60 Vigor. You'll probably want to take this up to 60 eventually. The reason I don't here is at this level that I'm at, 151, I really need to spend the points into Mind and Endurance for this build. Mind-wise, I have 26, and I would really like to have more here. Really, Onze's Line of Stars is an expensive weapon skill if you use the whole combo. It's something like 26 FP to do the whole combo, which is quite extensive, especially if it takes you 2 combos to kill 1 elite. You're looking at 52 FP every time you do that. So that can be a lot of FP to go through, and that doesn't include if you're buffing with Scholar's Shield periodically as well. So getting maybe 30, 35 Mind eventually wouldn't be bad. Endurance is at 30 here, mostly for stamina. If you're going for a block counter style build, you're going to need a lot of stamina to absorb those hits and then be able to return attacks. So 30 is kind of the minimum I would go for here. 35 or 40 would be better. Strength is at 12 to meet the minimum requirements for the shield, and 21 Intelligence is there to meet the minimum requirements for the sword. All my other points left went in Dexterity, and eventually you'll take this up to 80 to get even more damage out of this weapon before continuing to increase Strength and Intelligence to get more damage. So when it comes to Flask of Wondrous Physique, you can go a few ways here. First of all, Stamina Recovery is not bad. So having the Stamina Recovery tier, you go through a lot of stamina when you're block countering with any build, and we're not using a great shield here even, so that can help you out in boss fights, get your stamina back so you can block an attack. The Opaline hard tier is also not bad for further increased protection. Bosses hit hard, so that's, you know, good in basically any build. You can also use the Thorny Crack tier to increase damage with successive attacks, but I just find I don't do that too much with this build, so I don't think that one is quite as good as these other two. And then lastly, the next one is the Deflecting hard tier, and what this one does is it effectively makes it so that your guard boost is increased if you block just before you get hit, and also increases your block counter damage if you block just before you get hit. So if you can get your timing down and you know the attacks of a boss, and you're not just standing there turtling behind your shield, you can actually boost your damage output with your block counters and make it easier to do guarding when you're in a boss fight. So this is one you should definitely consider using as well. And then when it comes to Great Runes, Radahn's is easily the best choice. More health, more FP, you need that for the weapon skill. It's expensive, and extra stamina is good for block countering and attacking. All those things are good. That's definitely the one you should use. So that wraps up my Starline Samurai build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This can be a tough weapon to use because its weapon skill is very, very situational, and I think by building around block counters to augment that weapon skill, you have an alternative when you can't use that weapon skill. Otherwise, you're using the very, very short reach of the weapon, and that can be tough to do. As always, if you have questions or you have further tips for people, please leave it in the comments, and I will try and respond to them as soon as I can.